Wind Energy Association, and also the China General Certification Center, who will provide some insights on the workforce needs in China. And then GWEC's Policy and Operations Director, Joyce Lee, will provide an overview of the offshore wind outlook in the APAC markets and the impacts of COVID-19. And then finally, Ed Maxwell from the Renewables Consulting Group, one of the supporters of this report, will provide some key insights from the workforce study. And we'll move on to the Q&A. Joining us in the Q&A will be all the panelists, as well as Li Ming Chow, who is GWEC's Asia Director, as well as Alistair Dundon, who is the chair of GWEC's Global Offshore Wind Task Force. As I mentioned, this is the report that we launched in April. If you haven't read it already, you can scan the QR code here to download the report. And before, I would also just like to mention, if you are interested in learning more about the impacts of COVID-19 on the global wind industry, to check out GWEC's COVID-19 Response Hub, which gathers all the most updated information about the impacts of COVID-19 for the wind sector. With that being said, I'll hand it off to Jakob, CEO of Global Wind Organization, who will provide some opening remarks. Over to you, Jakob.
Thank you, Alyssa. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So this is our third edition of this webcast. I'm really pleased to be working with GWEC to present this first output of our partnership. And also grateful to Mr. Chinayan, my great friend from the China Wind Energy Association, to co-host this webinar and help us kick it off. I will leave it to Ed Maxwell at the end, as you saw on the first agenda, to go through the details of the report. He is really the brains behind the math. But for now, I'd like to go through an introduction of who we are, Global Wind Organization, and why we have partnered with GWEC and RCG to create this report. Next, please. So we are a not-for-profit global wind turbine manufacturers and owners association, much similar to GWEC and China Wind Energy Association. We differ in the fact that we focus on injury-free work environment in the wind industry, and we do this by creating and helping industries to agree on common and global standards for safety training. So at now, more than 90,000 people or wind technicians globally have a valid GWO training to their name. And we aim to double this number in the next 3 years. Globally, however, some 1 million people, technicians, work in the wind industry and are in scope for safety training. So our work is far from done. A large part of the growth that we look into in the coming 3 years comes from Asia, especially China, and we benefit tremendously from collaboration with China Wind Energy Association. So thank you for this, Chin. The core modules that you can see on the screen here were created in 2012, and those core modules are relevant for all wind technicians working in wind industry. Whenever you touch a turbine, onshore, offshore, the core modules are relevant for you. However, when you go offshore, there are some unique requirements for the workforce and for the safety training, and that's why the sea survival training was created. It looks specifically at, or mostly at, access and egress from vessel to TP. So when you travel to the turbine, how do you get from your vessel to the TP and back safely? X Maxwell will explain a little bit later how we use this module as an indicator for the workforce needs and workforce training needs in the wind industry offshore. And as you can see on the screen, there are more standards. That's because we create more and more safety training standards and agree on more and more with the wind industry. It makes sense for everyone to have a common view on this. We gain not only safety, but also efficiency. On safety, because it's quality assured, all of the training centers have been visited by a third-party auditor, and we know that the quality of training they deliver is according to the specifications that we give in the standards. So as a duty holder, you know exactly what kind of training has been received, and what kind of quality training that is. And since we can verify the training digitally through our online database, it means we have a far superior solution to verifying training than to the old PDFs or paper certificates from a training center that you didn't know. This is the bottom line of this in efficiency is that our employers in the membership report to us that on average, on the basic safety alone, the core modules, they save on average 5 days per year per technician. So 5 days per year per technicians in increased efficiency. That's 2% of the work time. That's quite a lot. And this is not necessarily because the content of these standards is much better than what someone else has provided to them. The thing is, we cannot say it always is, because we don't know what other training content is. But this is mainly an effect of conforming to a common standard that everyone agrees and that we verify in the same way. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so COVID-19. We have all now had at least 3 interesting months. And I just wanted to cover this very briefly. We have more than 1,000 technicians per week that run out of validity. This started out in China, but has quickly spread throughout the world with technicians running out of validity. And we see that more than 1,000 technicians run out per week. And why is that a problem? Because if you've done a safety training course, a GWO course or other, you know that those are skills that you train that you should hopefully never use. You practice your ABCs or your CPR but you don't practice that every day. Hopefully you don't use it every day. So that skill fades and you need to retrain it. And that's basically why we have a requirement for workers to refresh their safety training every 24 months. Your skills fade. And when you cannot refresh your skills, then you have an increased risk of when something goes wrong on a turbine. And all through this crisis of COVID, we have had to keep the turbine spinning, and we've had to rely on the technicians to keep them spinning. And it's only right that we keep them safe while doing this. So one of the things that we have done is a virtual classroom training that can carry a person from a skills fade situation and with a theoretical content 6 more months into the future before you go back to a training center and do practical training. If you need to know more about this, I mean, I can answer in the Q&A after, or you can write to us at infoglobalwindsafety.org, or you can go to our website. The information is readily available. And next slide, please. So we have a network, a global network, and I think this slide is a little bit old, but never mind. You get the drift. More than 360 training centers around the world are certified. There's an easy access to a commonly agreed training standard everywhere. But as wind markets have grown, especially in Asia, are growing in Asia. This is where we focus our attention right now. We're focusing in Asia and in the Americas. In Asia is where some of our growth is coming. The additional 100,000 that we're looking for, and of course, one of the ways that we measure our contribution to safety is looking at how many people are trained and how many training centers do we have. Last year, India and China grew by 85% in terms of safety training. And in the last 12 months, China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan are becoming key players in our world of safety training. Offshore technicians can train in all of those countries, can also receive training in Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and Vietnam should be coming on soon. So we do see investments in training centers and in supply of safety training in this region. However, one key element in deciding whether to invest in delivering a training is to know how many technicians need this training. How many people are going to come through your door to create a sound business case for you. And that is basically why we partner with GWO to do this report, to give some visibility into how many people will be going through the door of a safety training center in the future, including in this region in Asia. I hope this will be useful to all of you. And with that, thank you. I look forward to the webcast.
Thank you so much, Jakob, for that presentation. I'll now hand it off to Mr. Qin, who is the General Secretary of the Chinese Wind Energy Association, as well as the Director of China General Certification Center, who will provide some insights on the China perspective for workforce requirements. Over to you, Mr. Qin.
Okay, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank Asa. Hello from Beijing, and I hope everyone is doing great. Please, first slide. Asa, okay. Next one. First, I want to give a brief introduction about some general information about wind power market in China. The new installed capability last year is 27 gigawatt, with a year-on-year increase of 30%, which make Chinese cumulative installed capability reach to 277 gigawatt. So it's a big the data. I think is number one installed in around the world. Wind 2.5 gigawatt is installed last year, which has a 52% increase compared to last year. The cumulative installed capability of offshore wind power reached 7 gigawatt. Clearly, offshore wind increased very fast in the past year, and I think this year will maybe get more than 3 gigawatt for offshore, because you all know in China next year the only 1 year we can get a subsidy from the government. From 2022, the subsidy will cancel. So everyone want to rush to install the new capability. In terms of regional layout, next one, please. Next slide. Okay, next. So for in terms of regional layout, by the end of last year, offshore capability in Jiangsu province exceed 4,000.
Oh, looks like we're having a connection issue with Mr. Qin at the moment. We'll just wait a couple seconds to see if he can reconnect. Meanwhile, I see there's a couple questions coming in that no new slides are being displayed on the screen. It's most likely a connection issue, so please try rejoining the webinar again so to see the new slides. Mr. Qin, are you with us again? All right, let's move on to the next presentation. In the meantime, while Mr. Qin reconnects, so I'll hand it over to Joyce Lee, Policy and Operations Director, who will give an overview of the offshore wind outlook in APAC markets. Over to you, Joyce.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. And thank you to everyone for joining our webcast today and being understanding about the technical difficulties which can sometimes happen. So just to reciprocate Jakob's marks earlier, GWEC as the industry association representing wind power around the world is very pleased to have partnered with GWO for this report, Powering the Future, which we launched in April. GWEC was primarily providing its market growth forecasts out to 2024 for this report, which drew upon our market intelligence data, our offshore wind data, for instance, forecasts out to 2030. So during this portion, I'll be reviewing our global growth figures. I'll be touching on the impact of COVID-19 on global installations, and I will also be providing some market-by-market commentary on the APAC markets that we covered in this report. Before I look at forecast growth, Alyssa, if you go to the next slide, I wanted to first review the current status of the offshore wind market. So this chart depicts the growth of onshore and offshore wind over the last 5 years. As you can see in the progression of the light blue bars at the top, we saw very strong growth last year in 2019 with 19% increase of onshore and offshore installations, which included 6.1 gigawatts of new offshore installations. And most of these were concentrated in mainland China, as well as in the UK and some other European markets such as Germany, Denmark, and Belgium. In terms of the share of total installations, offshore wind last year comprised 10%, and we're going to see that ratio increasing over the next decade, which is a reflection of strengthening policy support in offshore markets around the world, as well as the cost reductions of offshore technology. Just a reminder that this data is contained in GWO's Global Wind Report, which is available on our website. Next slide. And now looking ahead to 2024, which captures the reference period for this report. So this is a global picture which foresees fairly steady growth in new offshore installations over the next 5 years. We have more than 355 gigawatts set to be installed by 2024, that's onshore and offshore, of which almost 51 gigawatts will come from offshore wind. And that's going to peak in that final year when 50 gigawatts alone is set to be installed in 2024. A good time to note that this forecast was dated Q1 2020, at which point we were viewing 2020 as a record year for new wind installations. You can see that we were forecasting more than 76 gigawatts this year. Of course, with the impact of COVID-19, as Jakob touched on, this forecast will need to be revised. It's important to note that most revision is going to constitute a redistribution of the annual installation. So a lot of new volume in 2020 will shift to the next year, but it's not going to be a drastic reduction of that total volume that we're forecasting over the next 5 years. Next slide. A little bit more on COVID-19 impact to the supply chain. The decline in 2020 that we're forecasting is around 19% of new installations. That equals 61.4 gigawatts of new volume this year, including onshore and offshore. This is a bottom-up calculation by GWO, which takes into account the different supply chain suspensions and construction delays experienced in major domestic supply and export markets like China, Italy, Spain, India, and the US from February onward. And you can see those highlighted in the map here. Most of the decline in 2020 for volume will come from onshore wind, but to give you a view of what it would look like in the offshore sector, we can go to the next slide, which focuses on the 6 offshore markets covered in our report. So in terms of COVID-19 difficulties ranging from order fulfillment to different construction delays, they are going to be most significant for our report's purposes in the mainland China market, where the majority of new offshore installations are concentrated. Other markets referenced here, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, and the USA, are less significant in terms of the volume forecast for 2020. So the 3.5 gigawatts of new volume in mainland China could be downgraded to at least 2.5 gigawatts because of lower production capacity, at least 6 months of delay for construction of offshore projects, and restricted imports of materials such as balsa wood. And I hope Mr. Tin can rejoin us and expand on this point later on in the presentation. Stepping back, it is worth highlighting why we chose these 6 markets for this report. So while in a previous slide, we were showing compound annual growth of installations of 4%, here for these 6 offshore markets, there's a pocket of very intense growth of almost 20% compound annual growth over the next 5 years. Together, these markets are accounting for 31 gigawatts of new offshore installations by 2024. And it's worth pointing out as well that nearly 2/3 of that volume is going to come from mainland China. So just to round up on the COVID impact, while there will be undoubtedly some changes to the annual figures, we are still fairly confident in the cumulative delivery of that 31 gigawatts 5 years out. Where we might see a slight downgrade is in the US offshore sector due to delays to projects which would have come online closer to 2024, as you can see from the beige bars at the latter end of this graph. So we will be releasing a revised forecast of COVID this summer, and that's going to account for market by market impacts. Encourage everyone here to keep checking our COVID-19 response hub on the GWO website for more. Next slide. I think I'll skip the mainland China market commentary. I can come back to that, but I was going to leave that to Mr. Tsin. Let's see if he can rejoin us afterwards. And then we'll move to the APAC markets, excluding China. So we're seeing very strong growth across several markets, led by Taiwan, of course, with 3.6 gigawatts forecast to be installed, followed by Vietnam, and then Japan, and then South Korea. And now just a few notes on each, beginning from the next slide on Taiwan, which now has 128 megawatts of offshore capacity installed at the Formosa 1 wind project, and is on track to become the second largest offshore market in the APAC region. Ambitious targets by government are driving this sector. We have 5.7 gigawatts of offshore targeted by 2025, and then a further 10 gigawatts targeted out to 2035. Offshore wind has also been highlighted as a critical sector to support Taiwan's green economy. Although looking ahead at challenges to the market, we're seeing localization requirements come up as a potential challenge, as well as critical reforms to the power market. This year, we should see the round 3 framework for that 10 gigawatts of offshore volume finalized, announced in the coming months, and then following an industry consultation, finalized by the end of this year. Next slide. So now moving on, Vietnam is the only target market for offshore in the fast-growing Southeast Asia region, although Indonesia and the Philippines also have technical potential for offshore wind. Vietnam currently has 99 megawatts of installed capacity, and there's a further 200 megawatts of mostly nearshore power coming online this year. And it's worth flagging up that in terms of Vietnam's technical potential, the World Bank has identified 475 gigawatts of fixed and floating potential in Vietnam. Offshore developments here are being driven by a feed-in tariff, which is due to expire in November 2021, which is why you can see bulkier volumes coming online in the next 2 years, reflected in the first 2 bars of this graph. However, this feed-in tariff may be extended due to permitting delays and the supply chain difficulties due to the ongoing pandemic. So GWEC was actually involved in some advocacy work with industry over the last few months and met with the MOIT, which has recommended a tariff extension to the Prime Minister. And this extension is currently being reviewed. Finally, in the longer term, the government is seeking to transition its procurement to an auction system in 2024. Moving to Japan, which had 66 megawatts of commissioned offshore wind by the end of last year, and more than 14 gigawatts in the permitting pipeline. Japan has taken very strong steps to accelerate its deployment of offshore wind from 2022 onward, as indicated in this graph. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, or MLIT, is promoting offshore wind development in 11 zones across the country. The first auction is expected in H2 this year for the area of Goto in Nagasaki Prefecture. And that's also an area being targeted for floating offshore wind up to 21 megawatts in size. So GWEC is bringing industry together for a cost reduction study to look at different industrialization scenarios for the sector. If there are any questions about that, we have Alistair Dutton on the line for the Q&A. And if there are any questions about Vietnam, I forgot to mention this, but we have Li Ming, Xiao, our Asia Director, online for Q&A. And then our final APAC ex-China market is South Korea, which is slated for fairly steady, although smaller scale growth in the region, with 560 megawatts due to come online by 2024. As with the other markets we covered, there are strong policy targets in place of 13 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and that has drawn strong interest from domestic and foreign developers. The targets are supported by President Moon's Green New Deal, which is aiming for South Korea to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The country's first commercial offshore farm is going to be the 40 megawatts project, which is off Jeju Island and was already completed in 2017. And then the one coming online this year will be the first phase of the Southwest Offshore Project. Also worth highlighting in this market are very large floating wind projects under development, including a 1 gigawatt project, which is 50 kilometers offshore from Ulsan. So overall, there's 31 gigawatts we're seeing for these 6 target markets. And if Mr. Tin is back online, perhaps we can hand it back to him to look at the mainland China market.
Yeah, thanks, Joyce, for that presentation. And we do have Mr. Chin back on the line now. So I'll just go back to his presentation and also remind you that if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A. So I believe this is a slide we left off on, Mr. Chin, so you can pick up your presentation from here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the signal is not good. So I close my camera, maybe more smooth. Now I continue my my presentation. As mentioned, by the end of last year, offshore capacity in Jiangsu province exceed 4,000 megawatt. It's the biggest in China. It's share more than 60% of offshore total installed in China, followed by Fujian and Guangdong with share of 7% and 6% respectively. Next slide, please. Please, next slide. So according to the near shore along the coastline has a very rich wind resource. According to China Meteorological Information, the China offshore wind resource exceeds 500 gigawatt in the area of water depths of from 5 meters to 50 meters at the height of 100 meters. The coastline is close to power load center, not only avoid long distance transmission, but also consumption problems. Please next. Now we talk about the impact of coronavirus on Chinese wind market. The control of the coronavirus outbreak in China is very effective. Now we are back to normal. The impact on construction is relatively less than on other chains. Since there is more than 1 year left to complete the task according to the subsidy reduction, hopefully we can make it with joint effort of the whole industry. The request of postponing the deadline of grid connector may not work because the government think for offshore you have more than 1 year to finish the work. But the industry still has confidence to complete the most of the project as scheduled. The global outbreak will address stress on Chinese wind industry. Please next one. Because the countries like Italy, Germany, and Ecuador, who are the originators of raw material and components, have gone into lockdown. Because of that, the import and export of raw materials such as wood and PVC, as well as components like bearing, gearbox bearing, and IGBT chips, are highly restricted. Such impact is supposed to remain till the first half of this year, but it's not clear in what degree international supply chain will affect Chinese wind market, because we are not run out of our repertoire yet. So we are now understand more than ever before the necessity of international cooperation. Wind power is a high globalization industry. Chinese wind power cannot develop without the technology and the product from many other countries. While Chinese technology and product also support the global wind development, we cannot survive without each other. We just locate the markets, but we are one industry as a whole. The lockdown is temporary, and the normal life will definitely return. But world we return will be difficult, be different, because we all better understand the close ties between different markets are essential for the prosperity of wind industry and for And several weeks ago, we signed a joint declaration with GWO and many other entities. We believe wind power is a key building block of economic recovery from the impact of coronavirus. For rebuilding a better future, government and financial institutions should ensure for the wind industry and energy transition as the focus of stimulate the package. Please next. Now, how about the training market in China? Here is the situation of GWO training in China. With the help of my friend Jacobo, we had established the GWO Chinese committee. It will help to introduce and promoting GWO training course and to build a harmonized working environment in China. By now, the committee has more than 30 members, covering associations, OEMs, owners, and third-party members. It includes all the main shareholder of Chinese wind industry. Also, we have 10 GWO training centers in mainland in China, but only 2 of them can provide sea survival training. Next one. Roughly estimate, China has nearly 40,000 offshore wind technicians work on the water. And by the end of 2020, we will have 4 training centers who can provide sea survival training. Assume that each training center can provide 24 courses with total 12 technicians in each course. And then each year we can only have 1,100 technicians trained. It's only 3% of the target group. In that case, it will take us 34 years to get all technicians trained. Not to mention that the number of technicians will grow with offshore wind development in China. So we can see there are huge potential training market in China. We need more facilities and more investment in training. The industry culture should be safety. Safety is always priority. So I think we will have a potential and good cooperation with GWO and make the China offshore wind industry go safety, go smoothly. So we need all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chen, for that presentation. If any of you have any questions further about the offshore wind in China and training needs, feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A. I'll now hand it over to our last presentation from Ed Maxwell, who will provide some further insights and findings from the workforce study. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Alyssa, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone listening and watching today. The Renewables Consulting Group were really pleased to work with GWO and GWEC on the Powering the Future report, and of course to join the webinar today. Our main role was to undertake the data analysis that you'll see presented in chapters 2 and 3. So I'm going to use the next few minutes to provide a very brief summary on the approach we took to the analysis and some of the key findings. There is, of course, much more detail and insight in the report, as I'm sure many of you have seen already. Our analysis was essentially split into 2 main parts. The first was simply to summarise the sea survival training that was completed in Europe between 2017 and 2019. And the second part was to use that training to estimate the number of trained personnel that will be required to deliver the forecasted growth in the key emerging markets. And we've already heard from Joyce about those growth estimates. So the first part was a relatively straightforward numeric analysis of the data. It's important to note at this point that the report only looks at offshore wind and therefore uses data on the GWO Sea Survival and Sea Survival Refresher modules as a measure for the number of personnel trained to work offshore. So the map that should be on your screens now shows the number of sea survival courses delivered during the 2017 to 19 period. And these are the 3 full years for which we have a complete data set in GWO's Winder database. And by some margin, the highest number of sea survival courses were completed in the UK, with large numbers also seen in other markets with large offshore wind sectors, so Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands in particular. There's training activity across Europe, and interestingly, even in markets such as Poland and the Baltic states, where there is no offshore wind capacity currently installed or under construction. Next slide, please. So this table shows the same training data alongside the capacity installed or under construction at the end of 2019 as a measure of market size in each country. And we can see a broad correlation between the 2 sets of data, although the UK and Germany appear not to train enough personnel for the size of their industries. And it's likely that countries such as Poland and the Baltic countries are exporters of personnel to projects in Western Europe. And this illustrates the really integrated nature of the European industry that clearly benefits from that free movement of competent people between projects and between the member states of the EU as well. Next slide, please. So over time, training completions have in general increased year on year, with a more than 50% increase over the study period. There was a notable slowing of that increase between 2018 and 2019, perhaps indicating some stabilisation of the workforce, or that we'd reached a critical mass necessary to support all the projects under construction simultaneously. Now, 2020 may see an increase in course completions again, as all the certificates issued in 2018 come up for renewal. This in turn is likely to be impacted by COVID-19, and of course we've heard from other speakers about how COVID-19 may address and may impact on training delivery throughout this year. Other key points that emerge from our analysis include a notable annual cycle where training peaks in Q1, where offshore activity is likely to be at a minimum due to weather restrictions, and decreases in subsequent quarters as offshore construction activity picks up. So seasonal patterns will be an important consideration when planning the demand and supply of training. And there's much more analysis of that nature provided in the report. I'm just trying to get through quite a high level summary for you today. So next slide, please. I want to touch briefly on the training providers operating in Europe. Together, the top 10 providers accounted for 2/3 of the training modules delivered. And in fact, the top 3 providers account for more than 4 in 10 of the courses delivered. And the others category that you'll see on this chart consists of a further 58 smaller providers, some of which deliver only a few dozen training courses over the 3-year study period. So while training is dominated by large providers, the door is certainly not closed to smaller institutions wishing to provide GWO courses. And the number of training courses in each market roughly corresponds with the offshore wind market, with the exceptions of those that I mentioned previously. Of note here is that in Germany, training is concentrated with a small number of providers, where the UK has many more providers, each training far fewer people on average. GWO training in Asia Pacific has grown rapidly in the past 2 years, and this has been driven by a combination of manufacturers building their own facilities, independent training providers forming new businesses, and maritime universities expanding their vocational portfolios. So examples include China's Goldwind Training Centre, where a large facility in Jiangsu province was opened in 2019 to train workers going offshore, and they expect to support many hundreds of workers over the coming years. And in Taiwan, both Kaohsiung University and Taiwan International Wind Power Training have opened large facilities in the last 12 months for offshore workers, building on the region's established history in maritime training. Southeast Asia is also moving quickly, and we've seen new training centres in Thailand, Malaysia and the Philippines. And as mentioned before, Vietnam is expecting to see its first training centres opening soon. Japan still only has 2 GWO training centres, one of which is focused on offshore, but there are encouraging signs of a change there too. Now, the underlying intent of this report was to forecast the number of trained personnel that may be required to deliver the large projected pipelines in the major emerging markets. And we can use the data that we've collected from Europe to address this. Next slide, please. And since we only have data for 2017, 18 and 19, and due to the 2-year validity period of the Sea Survival course, it's only really possible to accurately estimate the size of the workforce for the 2019 calendar year. And to do this, we interrogate the Winder database and simply count the number of persons holding a valid Sea Survival certificate. And there are, of course, caveats to assuming that all those holding a Sea Survival certificate are active members of the workforce. And these limitations are explored and detailed in Table 9 of the report. But we do believe that Sea Survival completions is a useful and valid indicator to estimate workforce size. And it's an estimate that we can refine as we accumulate more data in the coming years. So at the end of 2019, the European workforce had grown to just over 25,000 trained personnel. And we then removed about 2,000 people who we estimated were involved with O&M activities on operational sites. And dividing this figure by the capacity added in 2019 and adjusting the data to reflect that construction phases are typically multi-year, we derive a figure of approximately 2.5 persons per megawatt installed. And this figure is likely to include those involved in foundation and cable installation, as well as turbine erection and commissioning. And on some projects, it will also include other personnel depending on the client or developer's requirements. So it's important to note we're not just looking at installation technicians here, we're looking at the whole workforce required to get that capacity developed and connected. And we can then apply that estimate of 2.5 persons per megawatt to the forecasted installations in the emerging markets to derive the workforce requirements to deliver that growth. Next slide, please. And we can conclude that to deliver the 31 gigawatts projected to 2024, 77,000 people will be required. And for the 25 gigawatts in the APAC region, we're looking at just under 63,000 people. Now, these people will not all be needed immediately, and some of that figure will reflect a degree of workforce turnover, which we've seen in Europe. We've not adjusted the figures for specific local conditions, although we do note in the report where local factors could impact on that workforce estimate. And of course, this figure only covers installation. Even more trained personnel will be required as we move into the operations and maintenance phases for these projects. So 63,000 people in less than 5 years, that's the key takeaway for me, at least from this study. It's put simply, it's a huge opportunity both for GWO, for its existing training providers, and for new providers looking to enter the APAC market. So that concludes my very condensed whistle-stop summary of the data part of the report. Thank you very much for listening. There's of course a Q&A opportunity coming up shortly if you have any questions, but for now I will hand you back to Alyssa.
Thanks so much, Ed, for your presentation. So we have about 15 minutes here for Q&A. I will hand off the first question over to Ifeanyi, who has a question for Jakob. Over to you. Can you just introduce yourself and then ask your question, please? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been a splendid time. My name is Ifeanyi, and I'm a graduate student, Renewable Energy Technologies in Ghana. And I would like to know what the outlook, the job outlook is for people that want to come into the wind sector. I also like to know what are the skills that someone who wants to work in the wind energy sector, particularly offshore, should be looking towards getting, and also if there are training centers available in West Africa, Nigeria, or Ghana precisely. Thank you very much.
Oh, Jakob, I think you're on mute.
All right. Okay, thank you, Ifeanyi. Thank you for the question and for your interest in this. So this report focuses mainly on safety training, so the training that you need after you have your basic training or your graduate studies. In the wind industry, we use all kinds of backgrounds. It is really an integrated industry, so all kinds of educations or backgrounds can find a role in the wind industry. I think that from engineering to electrical to business, even medical, we have it all. So at any place in the wind industry, there will be something. When we're talking about installations, maintenance, and operations technicians, usually the background is with some kind of electrical or mechanical background. On top of that, we will add the basic safety skills or the safety training courses and some platform-specific courses, so you get to know the turbine itself. So there are some additional training that you will receive as you enter into the industry. Most of the backgrounds of people that work on turbines have either a civil or military background with electricity or mechanical studies. A lot of people from the maritime world as well. So you asked, do we have training centers in Ghana or East Africa? I don't believe that we have a sea survival training center near you, but I've sent you, I think in the chat, a link to our website where we have a map and a list of training centers available worldwide, so you could find a place close by. Depends a little bit on the labor market where you are. In some labor markets, your employer will supply this training for you. In other markets, they will expect you to get there with the training. Fortunately, a lot of community colleges and public schools, including in South Africa, are giving this training as part of a government-sponsored training. So I hope this answers your question.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you very much.
I wish you all the luck.
Thank you.
You're muted, Elisa.
Thanks, Jakob. Thank you both, Jakob, for your answer, and Ifeanyi for your question. I'll now hand it off to John, who has a question for the panel. John, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much to all of you for making this webinar a very interesting experience. Good information on the Asian markets in general, and also especially on the training needs in some of these markets. So very interesting all over. But I had one question, or a couple of questions actually. And just for introduction as well, I'm heading up Wind and Solar at the Norwegian Energy Partners, a industry body from Norway with supplies for offshore wind as well. Now the question for Joyce actually is, we also do some estimations on South Korea, and I was a bit surprised by your estimations there in terms of speed of installation going forward. So could you elaborate on that a bit in terms of, relatively limited yearly installations, but big policy? If you have some other thoughts on that, we'd be delighted to understand your thinking.
Great. Thank you very much. This is an excellent question, John, because quite rightly you point out that there's a dramatic asymmetry between that 560 or so megawatts we're seeing come online in the next 5 years, and then the government's 13 gigawatt target by 2030 in the next 10 years. So it's a very fair question about the forecasting. And I think to answer this, we can look at a few of the enablers and then a few of the potential challenges in this market. So of course, on the policy side, there is that big ambitious target, 13 gigawatts by 2030, as well as the government's larger renewable energy targets, which include drawing 30% of power from renewables by 2040, and then it's much lauded 2050 net zero target as well. The political conditions are, I would say, favorable. We saw President Moon win his landslide victory, an unprecedented majority in parliament earlier this year. And the conditions for development of supply chain for offshore are also favorable. As we know, South Korea is seen as an industrial hub in the Northeast Asia region, and it has advanced manufacturing sectors as well as a very comprehensive shipbuilding industry. But I would point to two reasons for perhaps more moderate growth forecasts despite these ambitious targets. And the first is that in this early stage of the market, there are certain challenges in the supply chain and permitting process. So while South Korea is a shipbuilding hub, it does lack installation vessels which are suitable for offshore wind. There's also a very strong lobby for the fisheries industry in that market, and both of these can prolong the planning and negotiation process. And then a second challenge is that there is a demand side driver in the form of the RPS scheme, the Renewable Portfolio Standard scheme, where energy producers in the country, which are producing more than 500 megawatts, are incentivized to produce renewable energy, but that also leaves heavy dependencies on the pricing and the potential price volatility of renewable energy certificates. So we might see, with the introduction of more certainty and stability in terms of compensation and acceleration of installations, but until then, we're taking a more moderate stance.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. If I can just continue, Alyssa. I had a question for Chin as well. Is he still...
Sure, John. I think Alistair just wants to chip in quick to add on to Joyce's answer, and then we can get to your question for Mr. Chin.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, John. Good to see you again. Excellent question from the points that Joyce made. But if you look at the projects, they are not very well advanced at the moment. So we only have, apart from the ones operating, 2 which are at a pre-construction stage, so still looking for finance and such, and only 5 at a consented stage. So taking the points that Joyce made, they've still got some way to go on the journey to get built. And these are not huge projects. So it may be a conservative projection, but we're comfortable with it at the moment, and we'd expect the sector to ramp up to the back end of the decade.
Are you still? Do you still think that the target of will be met, or do you have thoughts around that?
I don't have the data in the market intelligence, but at the moment I think it's challenging. They've got, as in every new market, it's putting all those pieces together, the complexity that we've learnt in Europe. So I'll leave the word challenging out there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alistair. Good to see you as well, and all of you, of course. Just to Chin, dear Chin, good to see you as well. I had a question there, and I understand that the decision might have been made, but is there any chance that these deadlines for support will be postponed after all, for offshore wind in particular?
Hello, John. It's long. How are you? How are you?
Thank you.
I think everything is okay in Norway. Okay.
Yes, fine here.
For the postpone the deadline, it's difficult because we have to do a lot of work. Maybe you'll see some reports. We read some suggestions to the government, but in China, some different department in charge of this one thing: financial ministry, Ministry of Financial, the NDRC, and the NEA are three departments in charge of this ICO. I don't know, maybe two ministry think it's okay. We should postpone the deadline for the industry, but the money department who in charge of money have more powerful. They said that it's difficult to. It's not so necessary to postpone because we have one more year to finish the project. So they make decision, no postpone requirement, no postpone necessary. So I think it's difficult to change the decision. This is the situation.
Thanks.
I had a follow-up question to that, actually, if I may.
If you can keep it very brief, because I still want to squeeze in one last question before we do the webcast. Yeah.
We know there are bottlenecks in terms of making the installations for 2020 and 21, and even more so now after the COVID-19. And in which areas do you have bottlenecks, and to what extent do you believe that European suppliers might help out and support the installation in China?
Oh, I think Mr. Chin is frozen.
Okay.
Maybe let's move on to the next question, and then when Mr. Chin comes back online, we can finish up the webcast with yours. So I'll now hand it off to Toshikazu Mito, who has a question on Japan. Could you just introduce yourself and ask your question to the panel?
Hello, good morning or hello, good afternoon. My name is Mito from talking from Japan. And I'm working together with the city municipality called Kitakyushu, and the city is very keen on the promotion of the workforce for wind energy. And my question is, one is about your report, you know, the workforce estimation, like we need more workforce need to be trained. Then the currently in case of Japan or even in China, the training facilities number is still like not enough. So we need to increase that number. So my question about your strategy, like GWO and GWEC, how are you going to increase, like promote the increase of the training facility for each target area like Japan, China, or other countries? Like, do you have any strategy? Like, are you going to rely on the market mechanism to private sector to establish more training facility spontaneously, or are you communicating with each government partner or some others? Like, or is there any way for us to support or work together on that? That is a question one. The question two is about the uniqueness of each target country. For example, in case of Japan, many local potential workforce might not be good at English skills. So how are you going to train, like through in English, or are you going to, you know, like have a unique system to train them by using their local language? And also some training might require, I understand, require some like a feature like for example Japanese regulations, specifically for offshore wind in case of Japan or China or South Korea or other countries. Like how are you going to introduce such kind of unique feature in the training menu? Like how are you going to adjust that? Do you have any like system on that? Like those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mito. These are three really, really excellent questions. I'm happy you posed all three of them because answers are interesting. So first of all, how are we going to make sure that there are more training facilities in Japan? We rely on the market mechanism to make sure that training centers are interested. And this is why we've created this report to make it more transparent to anyone who wishes to get certified. What are the opportunities here? Well, that said, we would also like to work with a local partner to help facilitate knowledge about GWO and help with the initial steps of establishing training centers. And what our plan is not to work through the government directly, but rather to work through a local wind association that represents the industry and has a legitimacy in the wind industry in Japan. This is what we have been doing in China with China Wind Energy Association. So a similar body in Japan would be the preferred way of working. And we are not a policy-making organization. We are about setting the global training standards. So that was question one. So question two, yes, lots of countries have challenges on English communication. I think even I mean, all countries and all peoples of the world prefer to speak their own language. The requirements and the documentation from the training center is something that we do in English. That's as a universal language. But the training itself can very well be delivered in the local language. That is not a problem. And training material to be developed by the training center itself can also be developed in the local language. So that should not be a problem. I think the most important thing for us is not to steer the language, but rather to make sure that the training center delivers the learning content. And that learning content can be delivered in many ways, and including in the local language. So that was question two. And to question three, workshops should understand at least the basic unique Japanese rules and regulations. And yes, these global training standards are minimum requirements, and part of the requirement to the training center is that they incorporate any local legal regulation that is over and above what is stated in the standard. So if there's something that is specific to Japan, that content must also be delivered in Japan. Yeah, and this is the same in all countries. So you will know that the person who comes from a training center in Japan will also have some understanding, the necessary understanding of the rules and regulations that are relevant to the course. Could be, as an example, first aid. In some countries, you are not allowed as a layperson to use an AED, an electrical heart starter. Yeah, in most countries you are, but in some countries you are not. Since that's part of the content of the training, we have to make sure that the training center will have to make sure that that is a known fact to the delegates. Mm-hmm. And if there are similar things in Japan, the certification body will make sure that the training center has incorporated local legal requirements.
Okay, thank you. Very quick question linked to the question. My question first question. Mm-hmm. Do you have any estimation, like how many more training facilities is required to answer to the demand for the current workforce? Do you have any number?
I think the number we would be looking at is how many people need to get trained. And as Ed talked about, when we look in the report, in some countries, training centers are rather small and have only a limited turnover of people, a few hundred people a year or even less. And other training centers train thousands per year. So the two training centers that have been established recently in Taiwan, they train more than 2,000 people every year, including in sea survivors. So quite a turnover. And interestingly, in Taiwan, actually, just a fact here, they have been during this crisis and during all of the weeks of the crisis, they've been training 160% compared to the level same period last year. And 90% of the people trained have been local workforce. So that also indicates that there is a local workforce generation in offshore wind that's quite significant.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jakob. And John, I think Alistair Dutton, who is actually chair of our Japan Offshore Wind Task Force, would just like to say a couple quick notes, and then I'll wrap up the webcast.
Yeah, just to build on, firstly, thank you for your question, Mito-san. To add to what Jakob had to say to your first question, GWEC has a very strong relationship with the Japan Wind Power Association. And as Alyssa just mentioned, I co-chair the Japanese Offshore Wind Task Force there. And Joyce touched on the fact that we're running a cost reduction study there at the moment to try and advise government on how offshore wind can expand very fast. So I'll pick up your question with the JWPA and introduce GWO to let's get some training centers in Japan, because it sounds very needed.
That's a deal.
Great.
Awesome. And it looks like Mr. Chin wasn't able to reconnect. So John, we'll follow up with your question on bottlenecks in China via email. If we didn't get to any other questions today, we'll also follow up via email. And if you didn't ask a question, but do have a question afterwards, please feel free to get in contact with either GWO or GWEC on the emails on the screen here. Again, we would highly encourage you to read the full report. So you can scan the QR code to download the report here. And on behalf of GWEC, GWO, RCG, and the Chinese Wind Energy Association, I would like to thank you all for joining us today and thank all of our speakers for their super interesting presentations and wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.